Hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and lots of interesting talks. Just a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm on my first year of my PhD, and this is a relatively new argument. It's the first time I presented, so I'm still finding my footing a little bit and how to best articulate it. But what I'm going to speak about is the sacred has participatory disclosure for recognition, attention, and the psychedelic experience. Now, why are we interested in psychedelics? A really good place to start is because they seem really therapeutically useful to treat things like addiction, like depression, and so forth. But also the experience is very weird. It's very peculiar. People report mystical experiences. That should also, kind of be an invite for philosophical curiosity. But even more importantly, are these two things connected? The fact that it's therapeutic and the fact that it's mystical. And the answer is yes, which is also very, very surprising. So I think this should be the frame, which is this clearly matters, and therefore we need to take the mystical seriously. And often there's a little bit of a reflex to not do that because mysticism has kind of like a bad rap in science. So a lot of times there's this tendency to either kind of reduce it to neuroplasticity, which some people have tried to do, the subjective experience doesn't matter, or to actually demolish the category itself of the mystical. So this is the typical mysticism wars. And generally speaking, in philosophy of psychedelics, there's kind of like two gravitational pulls. Obviously, this is a bit of a false dichotomy. I'm oversimplifying, but it is a little bit of a helpful frame. On one hand, a lot of times, especially from the neuroscience side of people, they talk a lot about brain dynamics, predictive processing, relaxed priors, and whatnot. So like everything is just in the brain, basically, and we'll try to explain the mystical experience that way. And another one is kind of this notion of the fact that people experience this is some kind of evidence, or at least it either proves or it's suggestive evidence that we actually need to completely revise our metaphysics from the position of assumed naturalism. That is. And so two good examples is Weil on one end, especially in his monograph, Philosophy of Psychedelics. He shifted a little bit since then. And then Peter Hughes is a really good example of kind of like this more metaphysical elements. He has done very good work on panpsychism. So, but either way, these two fields, they both have a tendency to put this into camps. It's either purely on my mind, or it's like a brute fact of reality out there, and they both kind of treat it as a proposition. It's kind of like, did people encounter something real out there, right? And it's just like either yes or no. I think this is a mistake, and it's not very helpful. So the reason why it's not very helpful is because that's not actually how human beings operate in the world. That's not what cognition is, and that's not what reality is, I would argue. Heidegger made this very, very explicit. There's an element of disclosure of the worlds before we even start to think about correspondence between what's in my brain and what's out there. And then obviously there's a huge lineage. Obviously he was already drawing from Husserl, but then it goes to Ponty, to Dreyfus and whatnot. And generally speaking, how we think about it now, in my opinion, with the latest Fourier Psi, is that it's best to think about meaning as that it's not just found, but it's also not projected either. And so Jaeger and Vervaeke call this the transjective, which I think is a really helpful term. So there's always a co-construction between the self and the agent out there. And it's also very influenced by Gibson from ecological psychology, and he actually names this very, very explicit even in his original writings. So for example, he says it's neither objective or subjective, it points both ways, right? So there's affordances in the world, and that affordances is always specific to both the thing as it is, so the object, like it's real, it's out there, but obviously it has to do with the agent, and that's what creates kind of this dynamic. And it's especially relevant for psychedelics because context matters a lot. Like set and setting are king, really. I just found a new paper yesterday that once again proves that you can have a lot of elements of the psychedelics just based on set and setting without any substance whatsoever. And there's also been a fair bit of evidence and arguments that we need to take that set and setting as real causal powers. Like a lot of times, especially in neuroscience in the beginning, there was all this tendency of like, it affects it, but it's kind of like this side ingredient that then we'll try to control a little bit in the clinical trials and whatnot. Turns out that's certainly wrong for a lot of reasons. And so really need to take like the whole holistic experience very, very seriously. And again, there's really good papers now that kind of take this 4E cogsi approach, complexity systems, dynamical systems, and so on, that really, it has causal power. Like you can't go around it. And you also see this effect, obviously, in the therapeutic outcome itself, right? So if you try to really optimize that set and setting, then the difference is very, very dramatic compared to if you don't and you're just like hoping that the molecule by itself does something on its own. Now, an issue with the current narrative and framing of psychedelic experiences is that they often very much talk about a loosening and a dissolution of the self. It's very much connected to this first pole that I mentioned in the beginning. And obviously that happens. We can kind of intuit that this is the case phenomenologically. There's also pretty decent neuroscience to back it up. However, it's not the complete picture because the way to think about it is that you're kind of demolishing a lot of structure, and that's part of what the therapeutic benefit is about. Because a lot of times, all these conditions that kind of like seem to benefit from psychedelics is precisely when people get fixed on something that kind of like becomes this kind of loop on itself that becomes this rumination where people can't open up. So for example, in depression, it's kind of like the world is closing, and then you have all these kind of looping thoughts, and then, you know, there's no self-worth and so on and so forth. And so it's kind of like this narrow. And same thing with addiction, same thing with trauma, things like that, right? So clearly there's a pathological structure, and then you're breaking that down, right? So that is valid, of course. So like there's a flattening of the basins. Is kind of like how it be put in kind of a complexity systems. The issue though is that there also needs to be reorganization, and this is talked a little bit. It's not completely ignored, but it's not given its due, in my opinion. And so, for example, in this nice paper here, they talk about kind of like 4 ways that this kind of like alteration can take place. Either there's a positive change, like we go to a more stable basin, or we revert to a maladaptive state, so we kind of go backwards. It can also be novel, so completely new, but still pathological, which is actually something that's not very addressed very well in the literature. For example, I think people that are familiar with psychedelics, they very often do encounter this kind of like, it is anecdotal, but it's still very important, I think, where into this rut of just like doing psychedelics, but then they don't get any better, and sometimes they even get worse. But in their head, they think they're getting enlightenment. And so I think that is a very nice fitting context for this third element right here. But the research doesn't really like to talk about it very much. And the fourth is collapse, assuming that there would be kind of like complete destruction. And even in the Rebus model, which is like where all this influence mostly came from about this entire dissolution, even then, kind of they do mention this, they do accept it. So obviously, because it's 2 special issues, which is like there needs to be a construction, and also we need to ask, what is that construction? Like what direction are we aiming for? And so Saffron also has this nice paper where he's kind of like trying to present this model that tries to make a little bit more justice to the meaning making that's added on top of the experience, and not just the dissolution element. And this is particularly important because there is no way to tell from a neuroscientific perspective or from like a purely complex systems perspective once that meaning making is pathological or not, right? So for example, there's a lot of literature and a lot of concern about false insights. But they kind of use the same machinery as the people who are getting better, more or less. So it's very confusing. So like the directionality seems to matter a lot. And so again, there's this flattening. This last paper here, there's this flattening, and then there's a reconfiguration. Some are more stable than others, but it's still an open space, right? So I think the question that we need to be asking more is like, where should we go, right? So reorganized towards what exactly? So to answer this question, again, coming back to kind of this Heideggerian way of looking at the world is the world is never neutral. Like, number one, it's never neutral because that's not how your cognition is built, because if it was, well, that wouldn't work anyway. But either way, the problem of relevance realization is key to understand this, which is it would be uncomputable to even look at the world neutral if that was even possible in the first place. So there's way too much raw data, and then us as cognitive agents, we reduce that to what is relevant. And this is not exactly the same, but pretty similar to what Heidegger was talking about when he mentioned care. So like things show up because of a particular reason and for a particular reason. Like it's very built into how the world shows up. And also, it's important to take into account that everything is very purpose-driven, like our very categorization, which is what cognition is made out of. So a thing becomes intelligible through the good that it serves, right? So for example, I have my coffee mug here, right? And like the cupness or the mugness in this case of the mug is very related to the goods that it affords me, right? It's good for something. Now the issue is that, okay, so given this notion of relevance and care and purpose, but there's a lot of different things that matter in the world, right? And like sometimes they conflict with each other. And so therefore you need to have a frame that kind of creates some sort of hierarchy about all these goods, right? And when you think about it this way, necessarily, you also have kind of like a peak and apex of that care, right? So for example, Tillich talks a lot about ultimate concern, which is like, it's the highest concern you have, and also in a lot of traditions, that's often considered about, because the highest good also orders the goods below, right? So it's like the overall, my overall stance towards what I think it matters, then kind of like has a downstream effect about how I think other more minor things happen. It kind of like structures my entire being. But it's also important to consider that even though this is how your cognition is built from the bare bones, you also experience this phenomenologically in a very basic everyday notion through attention itself. And what I think is really missing from a lot of psychedelic talk and research is that attention is morally driven. And people don't like to talk about it because, again, morality is also something that's not the easiest to talk about from a scientific perspective. But it is how, again, the world is built. And this is not any woo-woo. Like we can still bring it back, again, to like very standard, very rigorous cognitive science. And so, for example, here, this paper from Kiverstein, attention is precision weighing, which sculpts the agent's moment-to-moment relationship with its environment, structuring the field of relevant affordances. But we are social beings, and so those kinds of affordances, they include our interaction with other agents that also have their own cares and their own way of looking at the world. And therefore, attention is always within a moral world. And I think Weil and Murdoch here are really, really helpful, and I think they really should be talked about more. So Weil has this really notion where attention is not a mental force. It's kind of like something that you need to be receptive to. And so you kind of have to kind of let go of your ego. And then as you do that, then the real appears. Like the real world that is not being like pathologically contained by your own kind of like fantasies and imaginings. But it also has a religious connotation because that's kind of like, it's very much associated with notions of ultimate reality, right? Like if you were truly in contact with the real, then it's kind of like, that is the apex of experience, right? And that's why she mentions, for example, she says absolutely unmixed attention is prayer, which is encapsulates it really, really well. And then Murdoch, building very much from Weil, for example, she mentions moral change comes from attention to the world whose natural result is a decrease in egoism, through which an increased sense of reality, primarily, of course, of other people, hence moral, but also other things. So it's like it's a holistic contact with reality. And she has this really nice example of the mother-in-law that she learns to re-see her daughter-in-law. So it's like before she was kind of selfish and prude, and then through her attention, she has like a shift of frame. And then she realizes that actually she's a really good person. But there's no new facts in the world, right? It's about attention, which then had this other result reconfigure the salience, like what matters, how you're making sense of the situation. But also this attention is towards like a more positive reconfiguration of reality, and Murdoch was very much influenced by Platonism. That's kind of her conceptual grammar, and I think it's good grammar. And she talks about it as this notion that we're being invited, and that's how for almost all of history how people have thought of it, that we have an invitation of reality through which we can participate in this field of affordances, which includes moral affordances, right? So she says beautifully, the good is the magnetic center towards which love naturally moves. And how you pay attention is more or less how you behave in the world, right? It is kind of like the bare bones of your experience, and so it's really a good way to think about the self as well. Like your being is how you pay attention. And again, we have this glimpse of what it can be, and we can try to follow it. But it's always in the future. It's kind of like in this realm of non-being somehow, and you perceive it again somehow, and then you kind of try to walk towards it, right? But it's something that you are participating all the time. And so she says beautifully again, Murdoch, our ability to act well when the time comes depends partially, perhaps largely, on the quality of our habitual aspects of attention. And she connects this to metanoia as well. So it's kind of, again, this Weil notion of letting go, and then through this unselfing, then you kind of grasp the real. And so you're in this process of constant transformation by trying to align yourself with the good. Now, in this process of transformation, obviously that's a little bit hard to make sense of, especially if you consider kind of A.L.A. Paul's work, where it's kind of like, okay, but how do you know what you're transforming to, or if you should transform to, because the very aspect of transforming changes the one who's being transformed. So like you might think something is valuable, but in that process, you also change. But then Collard has a really nice answer to that, which is aspiration, which is, again, you see this glimpse of the good, and then you constantly walk towards it, even when you don't fully understand it. And you understand it more the more you practice it, the more you embody it. And so this whole bridge between your actual self and your future self is something that you are enacting in the world, and it can't be purely inframed in your head. But all this notion of attention might seem a little bit individualistic, but attention is also communal, because we learn from others, and others also paying attention to other things, and so you kind of compare how you look at the world compared to how other people look at the world. And so again, coming back to cognitive science, this is not any woo-woo. Like they mentioned, for example, that a learned skill that crucially involves other practitioners who selectively introduce the novice to the right aspects of the environment. Right? And there's also a lot of research about how our sense of transformation of what to walk towards is very influenced by other people that we can look up to, and then we kind of try to imitate that. And so I think this is really important to take into consideration when we're thinking about the psychedelic integration aspect, where this aspect of culture, of the environment, that shapes how people transform and how people try to kind of continue that process of transformation after the experience, right? And that's not in the substance, right? That's a way of life, basically. So there's this neuroplasticity, but then, okay, but what do you do after? So this paper by Reveke and colleagues kind of mentioned this religio, which is kind of like one of the proposed etymologies of religion, has this dynamic binding between the self and the world through embodied engagement, and that's what religion is supposed to be. It's about this enhancing this coupling. And I mentioned here the communal aspect because it's easier to talk about and I don't have a lot of time, but obviously ritual would also play a large role here, also symbols, also narrative. But the important thing is that it's all a package of training your attention to a particular purpose and then helping you on the way as much as possible. And so I think this is what's missing a lot of times in talk of philosophy of psychedelics, which is the fact that transformation, which we care so much about psychedelics, why don't we care about everyday life? And that's largely what religion is about. If you, in my opinion, if you look at it from this frame, which I think is accurate historically. And so, for example, Houston, in a very classical paper, drugs appear to induce religious experiences. It's less evident that they can produce religious lives. Now, for secular people, you might think, well, I don't care about the religious life, but you can kind of replace a little bit religious life with a virtue-oriented life, and that's still pretty close. And so I think what we need to consider more is kind of like these thick ecologies of attention, as I'm calling them here. I think this is what is missing from a lot of integration work. And I think that will be better than simply focusing on the experience, and even better than focusing on the experience plus integration, but kind of like a very shallow integration that we usually have, which is just like, oh, just talk a bit about it and like try to meditate and whatnot. I think we need to treat more as a whole package, which is what religions are about. So just to end up here, I know slightly over time, but so this is what I mean by the sacred has participatory disclosure. It's kind of like, it's something that is always this kind of like two-way, and it's something that you always need to participate. The world is constantly disclosing if kind of you act on it. Like, it's not in your head, right? And so it's, again, it's not the supernatural object, but it's also not the private feeling, right? And so what I like to call it is that the sacred is this meta meaning function, right? It's kind of like, it's that upon which other judgments are made. It's your base orientation in the entire world. And so if you notice, for example, the cognitive grip in the first part of the talk of about the more cognitive science aspect, the way to think about the sacred has participatory disclosure is that it's kind of like the ultimate cognitive grip, right? It's kind of like it's the optimal grip of optimal grips, and I think this notion is very helpful for psychedelics because I think it can improve, number one, the rate of non-responders, which is often not talked about enough. We just kind of expect, yeah, some people get better, some people don't. It's just how it is. To some degree, yes, but maybe we can improve that. And also, kind of like the slope of the diminishing effect of the psychedelics that can be potentially improved as well. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.